As you were getting ready to load your bike, did you hear anything down the street?
Loading my bike?
Yeah, as you were loading your bike into the back of the pickup truck?
He's screaming for his life.
I'm sorry, say that again?
The man's screaming for his life.
You heard Brian Leverett screaming for his life?
Yes.
Did you hear him screaming help also?
Yes, please stop.
You loaded your bike in the back of the truck and left though, right?
I went back now, checked on his mother. She was an older lady, so
Okay. Before leaving, you checked on their mom?
yes.
Was the door open at that time?
Yes, sir.
Standing wide open, right?
Yes.
In fact, the door had been standing wide open throughout a lot of this encounter.
Right.
Was their mother in bed asleep?
No, she was at the kitchen table, by the kitchen table. When I walked in, checked on her, asked if she was alright, and then I walked out and left.
But everything was fine.
Right.
You hop in the truck and you leave with Mr. Bourne.
Yes.
Do you remember which direction you headed? Towards Roosevelt or towards the circle?
Towards like the exit to the main road. I guess it's called Roosevelt.
If a witness reported that the green truck first went westbound towards the circle, would they have any reason to say anything other than what they saw?
Facing this way. We had no choice to go that way.
Okay.
We had went like this and took a right.
Okay. And turned around and went out to the main road?
Yes.
And you went home?
Yeah, we tried to pull over.
You got pulled over by the police?
Yes.
You remember being handcuffed, secured, and searched by the police officers?
Yes.
And this was while they were on their way to Wayne and Ray Greenlaw's house, right?
Correct.
Because there's no way to get to their house without first going through the area that you were fleeing.
Yes.
We all met with you last week. Do you remember that? And we tried to talk about and clear up some of the inconsistencies in your testimony that you had given previously. Do you remember that?
Yes.
There were a lot of inconsistencies, right?
Yes.
Okay. Because your memory has been difficult over time.
Yes, sir.
Is what you're testifying here today the truth?
Yes, sir.
No objection on that, Mr. Jury.
Sustained.
Is your testimony here today based upon your recollection of these events?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Counsel to defendant Wayne Greenlaw on examination.
Ma'am. So how are you doing this morning?
Right, it's better.
Yeah, I'm assuming you could be doing better. Let's start. We have a lot of things to cover. Let's start with your sobriety on the morning that all this took place. Do you recall a deposition that we gave you on January the 31st of 2012? 3 months after this took place. Do you remember that?
No, sir.
Do you remember coming in and talking to us?
No.
I want to put this in front of you now. I'm going to ask you some questions about it, but first, before I inquire about that, do you have trouble reading?
Yes, sir.
And As a matter of fact, at one time, whenever we were talking to you, we asked you to spell your name. You had trouble spelling your name, didn't you?
Yes.
How well do you read?
Not good.
Now, on January the 31st, of 2012, Mr. Ballerino had asked you some questions, I had asked you some questions, and then Mr. Will was asking you some questions. And the first question that he asked you was how much you had to drink that night. You remember that?
I think so.
And do you remember what you said?
A couple cases.
Well, 3 or 4 cases, maybe?
Yeah.
How many beers are in a case?
And like you get a 24 pack or 18, right?
And do you recall which one you got?
18.
I'm not very good at math, but 32. That's 72 beers if it's 4 cases, right?
This is
Now, you weren't the only one that was drinking those beers, right? Some other people were drinking those beers, but do you recall telling Mr. Will that you probably drank about a case and a half?
yeah.
Now, that was while you were over at Mr. Greenlaw's house, right? Right, at Mr. Greenlaw's house. Prior to going to Mr. Greenlaw's house, do you recall telling him that you had also drank over at your house?
Yeah.
How many beers did you drink at your house?
Well, 6 beers.
And then you went out to Dry Lake, and you had beers out of Dry Lake too, didn't you?
Right.
How many beers do you have out of Dry Lake?
4 or 5.
And then, I'm sorry?
That's just what I brought with me.
Okay. And while you were there, Ms. Walls also had some Jim Beam with her, didn't she?
Yes, so
Did you drink any of that?
I might have a shot or 2. Don't remember.
So, at the end of the day, when Mr. Will was asking you about that, the conclusion was that you had drank somewhere between 42 and 50 beers and some whiskey. Was that right?
Yes, so
And then he asked you about what kind of impact that had on you. Do you recall that?
no.
Do you remember him asking you questions about whether or not you were having trouble with your motor skills?
No, sir.
Do you know what motor skills are?
Yes, I barely got any, but yes.
Okay. And if I told you that your response to that was yes, would you have a disagreement with that?
No.
Do you remember him asking you whether or not you were having trouble with perception? Being able to remember and see things? Remember what your response was? If I told you yes, would you have any disagreement with that? And if you do, we can open up the book and I can read it to you because I know you have trouble reading, right?
Judge, I'm going to object because that wasn't the premise of the question. Page 31, line 15.
I'm going to read you the question that was asked, and then you can read the response. If you can, let me know. Do you read numbers?
No way to where.
So, let me see if I can open it up so that you can see the numbers. See those numbers right there? See the number up the top of the page? Those numbers are the lines, okay? question that he had previously asked you prior to line 18 was the question that started on line 15. You see line 15? And he's, the question, this is question, anybody who drinks 36 beers in 12 hours is going to be pretty drunk, right? And what was your response?
Yes.
They're going to have trouble with their motor skills, right? And what was your response?
Yes.
They're going to have trouble with their perceptions. What was your response?
Yes.
They're going to have trouble with their memory and their recall. Yeah? What was your response?
Said yes.
And then his next question was, and did you have these problems too? What was your response?
I apologize. Hold on a second. Can I look at his?
That was my problem. Yeah, I'm missing page 32. I apologize, Judge. Sorry.
Yes.
All right, so would it be fair to say that on the morning that all this happened, that you were, I believe as Ms. Laws put it, smashed, hammered?
Yes.
All right, so with that as backdrop, I'm going to start back and go forward. You left the Greenlaw's house somewhere right before 6 o'clock that morning. Is that correct? Your stepfather came and picked you up in the green truck.
Yes.
Remember that? And you got stopped by the police.
Yes.
And you gave the statement that Mr. Will is just referring to while you were in the police car that morning in handcuffs, weren't you? And do you recall Mr. Will asking you a question about your ability to focus and losing focus that morning and when it was that you might have lost your ability to focus?
I don't remember.
When you were sitting there in that police car that morning, a few minutes after you had left the house, what was your state of sobriety?
I don't know.
You were just drunk,
I was
weren't
pretty much sleeping in the cop car when it was like, when they're talking to me. I was sleeping in the cop car when there was an officer and they're talking to me.
So, when they asked you questions that morning in the statement that Mr. Will referred to, your sobriety was not good. You had been drinking profusely. You were drunk, weren't you, Mr. Searles?
They don't want to ask me any questions when I'm drunk, so.
Well, and I think that you may have addressed that issue in questions by Mr. Will. Should go over, well, can you find page 45? Find it? Go to lines 8 and 12. And Mr. Will is asking you a question about, well, your statement that you're giving us here today on the 31st contradicts the statement that you gave to the police back in the morning. And then he proceeds to say, you were either lying then or you're lying now. Is that what it says on lines 8 through 12?
Yeah.
And what was your response? On line 13.
I can't read that.
I'm not lying. Okay? Well, next two lines, one of them's not true because they cannot be. Look at lines 13, question from Mr. Well, line 14 and 15. And then in line 16 through 19, what did you tell Mr. Wells in line 16 through 19? Can you read that?
No.
Your Honor, may I read his response for him?
Is there any objection, Mr. Will?
No.
May?
Question from Mr. Will. Well, one of them is not true because they cannot be. Answer. Well, when you talk to somebody when you're intoxicated and you talk to somebody when you're sober, those pictures ain't gonna match. I don't care who you are. You remember telling him that?
Yes, sir.
But if this transcript of this deposition says that's what you told him, do you have any reason to believe that that isn't the case?
No.
Okay. All right. So, well, let's leave that there because now we're going to go through your deposition. So, when you gave a statement to the police on the morning right after all this took place, you have told us what your state of sobriety was and what problems you were having. When you came to our deposition on January the 31st of 2012, were you under the influence of alcohol whenever you gave us that deposition?
Yes, sir.
You were sober, weren't you? And your recollection of the events in your state of sobriety was better, was it not?
Yes, I try to remember as much as I could.
Exactly. So let's talk about what you told us when you were sober.
Okay.
Okay? Let's start at the beginning, shall we? Do you recall going over to Mr. Greenlaw's on the evening of the 28th of October, which would have been the afternoon hours before all this stuff happened on the morning of the 29th?
Sure.
Well, I believe Mr. Will asked you on direct examination as to whether or not it is that you went over to Mr. Greenlaw sometime that afternoon and sat around the fire pit drinking. Do you remember him asking you that?
Yes.
Well, you did that, didn't you?
Yes.
And you told us that back at your deposition on page 7, lines 8 through 10, that you went over to hang out, drink some beer, and have a fun at a bonfire behind his house. Do you recall that? Now, you've been to his house on a number of occasions over the preceding year, have you not?
Correct.
And you knew where his backyard was. And there was a fire pit back there because he had cleared some brush and stuff in his backyard, had he not?
There was 2 trees in his yard. That's about it, as far as I know.
Yeah, so he had cut and trimmed some of those, and the wood that was burning in that fire pit had come from the things that he had trimmed.
Right.
Okay. And you told us that you got there sometime around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And there's some other statements that you have given that said that that may have been 6 or 7, but in any event, you got there sometime in the afternoon. And eventually Kendra came there. And at some point in time, did y'all all sit back out by the fire and drink beer?
Yes.
Okay. Now, were you drinking beer out there just sitting around the fire, or did you pull the Jeep back into the backyard and sit in the Jeep and listen to music and drink beer?
I don't remember.
All right. But at some point in time that night, you asked in the backyard for Ms. Walls to marry you. Is that correct?
Correct.
And after having done that, Wayne offered to let the two of you have his Jeep and go out to Dry Lake.
Correct.
All right. And do you recall telling us at or about what time it was that you went to Dry Lake that night?
I don't remember.
And if I ask you to go to page 9 of that deposition that is in front of you. And find lines 4 and 5, please. And if you can read that, read it. If you can't, would you let me know if you can't read it?
You want to read that?
I'm sorry?
You want to read that for me?
Any objection, Your Honor, from this point forward,
Read
Mr.
the
Will?
line,
is
you
going
do
to
without
give you-
asking unless Mr. Will has any
Okay, very
objection
good.
to any plan in the future.
All right, thank you. And the question was, okay, about what time was that? I'm going to say about, it's got to be about 12 or 1 o'clock. And do you have a recollection of that today?
No.
But that's what you told us back on January the 31st. Is that correct?
Guess so, yes.
Okay. Now, you told us then that Kendra wasn't much of a drinker, was she?
No, she was not a drinker.
And that, as a matter of fact, what she usually drank was 2 or 3 beers.
Usually.
Okay. And, matter of fact, on page 10, lines 2 through 7, you tell us that 2 or 3 beers, that's her limit.
Usually she drives, because we got 2 kids.
Right. So, she doesn't drink a whole lot, she's got 2 kids, so you were drinking a whole lot back then, right? And on this particular day, we already know about what you did, but it was not uncommon for you to drink 36 beers or so every day, was
Not every day, but it was common for me to drink, yes.
So, y'all were sitting around till 12 or 1 o'clock, you borrowed the Jeep and you went out to Dry Lake. When you got out to Dry Lake, do you recall meeting who you described as a person that introduced themselves as Brian and his friend out there?
Right.
And do you recall telling us that you did not know Brian until that night?
Right.
And you didn't know his friend, right? And that friend would subsequently be a gentleman by the name of Mr. Riley, Justin Riley. Is that right? Had you ever met Justin Riley before that night?
No.
Absolutely not.
No.
Okay. Ever met him since? Okay. So you had absolutely no idea who he
No, I didn't.
was? Okay. You went on to tell us that they approached you and Kendra, and y'all sat around and hung out and drank more beer. Do you recall that?
A couple.
You told us what kind of a truck that Mr. Riley was driving. Do you remember what kind of a truck it was?
Sure, no, sir.
You don't remember? Would you go over to page 12, please, line 7? Question, were they in a truck or a car? Response, a black truck. Do you remember making that response, or should we just assume that at this point in time, you don't have much of a recollection even of what you told us on January the 31st.
Right.
Do you recall telling us that you sat out there with them for about an hour and a half or 2 hours?
Yes.
Now, at or about 4:36 that morning, do you recall getting a phone call from Mr. Greenlaw?
I think he was checking on his feet.
Madam Clerk, Your Honor. I don't want to read your phone number into the record, but I want you to read this number and tell me whether or not it was your number, okay?
Try to remember it.
For the record, Judge, this is Defense Exhibit KKK.
Yeah.
I want you to tell us the number, but I want you to look at an entry that is marked 4/37/2021.
Mhm.
Now, the entry marked 4/37/21. Do you see that, Mr. Sterling?
Sure do.
That is an incoming call, is it not?
Yes.
And it is to you
Yes.
from a number that you recognize, is that correct?
Correct.
And that number that you recognize belonged to whom?
Wayne?
And how long did the call last? You see it under the term duration?
I don't know how to look that up, sir. Like 4 minutes and 46 seconds? 5 minutes. Three and a half minutes.
Phone call lasted 3.5 minutes. Now, the records that are in front of you, that phone log that is in front of you, do you recognize the number up at the top without telling me what that number is as to whose phone that was?
Mine?
Your Honor, I would ask that this be marked as defendant's next.
Any objections as well?
Yeah. A certified record, he's not a phone records technician. It's a predicate for anybody who bids.
May I have a moment, please?
the introduction of that exhibit, Mr. Ballerino? All right, it will be admitted as defendant's exhibit number 27. Yes.
All right, so, and do you recall telling us that when you got that call, that you were still out at Dry Lake?
Yes.
Okay. Now, on the afternoon, strike that, when you were taken into custody by the police on the morning of the 29th, you gave two statements to the police, did you not?
I'm guessing so.
One of them occurred right after you were taken into custody, and the other one occurred at or about 11:48. By that time, they had released you, had they not? And you had gone home. And Mr. Will asked you about Investigator Horton. Do you recall that? Do you recall Investigator Horton coming over to your house and talking to you?
I don't know.
Now, at 11:48, you had been, the first statement was at 9:20. This is 2.5 hours later. And 2.5 hours later, you were asked a series of questions about what had taken place out at Dry Lake. And on page 61 of that transcript, I want to direct your attention, Mr. Searles, to lines 18 through 24. Actually, lines, just to start with lines 17 and 18 on page 61. Can you read that, or do you want me to read the question and the response?
Can you, sir?
I'm sorry?
Can you?
This is Investigator Fortin asking you, says, the question that she poses on lines 9 and 10, so you and Kendra left and went driving through the woods. Response, yes. And we went to the first trail after. It's almost like leaving Dry Lake. And then we came out the first house right across from there. There's another, like a play area for four-wheelers or something. So we parked over there, and we seen them leave. And then Wayne called. Who is the "we seen them leave" that you're referring to there?
Huh?
You said you saw somebody leave. Were you referring to Brian Leverett and Justin Riley? Y'all saw them leave?
Yes, sir.
So you saw them leave, and then you got a phone call from Wayne. Now, we've already established that the phone call came in at 4:37, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, while you were in the midst of that phone call, where this was a phone call Wayne called you, is that right? While you're listening, while you're talking to Wayne, do you recall hearing anything through the phone happening at Wayne's house?
No.
If I were to direct your attention to that same page, line 21 and 22, then the question, and then 23, 24, 25, and then over on line 1 of the next page, can you read that question and answer, or would you prefer that I do it?
Read it.
And this is Investigator Fortin asking you the following questions. So leave, and then you heard these two. I heard these two guys at the house, and I'm pretty sure that it was them. Because they left. 5 minutes later, Wayne called. Over there, if I'm not mistaken. So, at 4:37, after you had seen Mr. Leverett and Mr. Riley leave, you get a phone call from Mr. Greenlaw, and you hear those guys in the background, don't you?
I don't remember saying.
But that's what you told the investigator that.
So, okay, so yes.
Now, go to page 62, right after that. Do you remember what you did after you got that phone call?
No.
If I could direct your attention to page 62, lines 4 and 5. Question posed by the investigator. And then your answer on lines 4 and 5. And I'll read the answer. You want me to read it, or do you want to try?
Read it, sir.
All right. Investigator Fortin asked you, okay, was Wayne saying something about them being over there? Your response: I'm not sure, because when I got there, they were gone. And then my old lady was saying that they just helped themselves in while I was out back by the fire. Now, when you got the phone call from Wayne at 4:37, the phone call lasted about 3.5, let's just say 4 minutes. It was 3 minutes and 50 seconds, I think, but let's just round up to 4. If you had 4 to 37, that's what it's about 4:41, doesn't it, in the morning? Okay. So the call ends about 4:41, and at that point in time, don't you and Kendra then leave and go back to the Wayne's house?
Yes, no.
Well, that's what you said there, right?
Yes.
Okay. But when you got there, they were gone, right?
Yes.
Now, if you are out at Dry Lake and you're in Wayne's Jeep and you're there at or about 4:41 in the morning, and you finish the call and you decide to go to Wayne's house, how long would it take you to get there?
Well, it's less than 5 minutes from the lake to his house.
All right. So you would have gotten there sometime, around 4:45 or so. And when you got there, did you see Mr. Riley or Mr. Lever?
No.
All right.
draw your attention to the time. If there's a stopping point, is now a good time? All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we'll take our mid-morning recess. We will be in recess until 10:40, subject to all prior instructions.
Don't leave anything within here, you can ask for help.
Council have anything we need to address? All right, we're in recess until 10:40.